So I think that's the end of the points we took from there. So once again, what we want to do is to hear from people about, first, what was not captured, what were some important things that came up yesterday you heard that are not on our list, or which things we think are not accurately represented or not clear. Which of those things would you want to add to or clarify?
I think differentiating observational studies a little bit more detailed would be helpful. So I think there's a big difference between looking at like the Nurses Health Study or Framingham structured registries, calling them observational studies, where their concern is about confounding. So you look at Nurses Health Study for postmenopausal hormone replacement and WHI, that's a real issue that you can dig your teeth into, and it's a structured observational study. To use the same word for looking at unstructured databases like electronic health records and calling that observational data, it should be differentiated, because there are other concerns that you have about that we talked about today, which is data quality and standardization, things like that. So maybe putting a little bit more of a layer of description of what we call observational studies would be helpful.
Yeah, and no, thanks. That's helpful. And I think, Sebastian had a really nice slide that we may want to steal from that, sort of, divided, as you say, up into these, the data collected. As I remember the little diagram, the way it went down the flow chart, there was the data collected for research, like Nurses Health Study, which still involve naturalistic comparisons, meaning research-generated data, but real-world assignment of treatments, and then data not collected for research, data which are the exhaustive healthcare and naturalistic assignment of treatments. So we had naturalistic comparisons in both trees, but they were on different branches of that tree. So I'm distinguishing between the data collected for research branch and the data exhaustive healthcare branch.
And Rick, one follow-up was, I think Greg during this session yesterday was really trying to focus on just having treatment assignment done through randomization. So in the way that he was trying to create swim lanes for each of the topics, his focus was not so much on data quality or collection or any of these other things. It was just, okay, in the absence of treatment assignment, then something is observational. So I'm just giving you, that was sort of where Greg, I think, was coming from. Is that fair?
Right. Well, I think, right. And we were focused on the question about the assignment of treatment. But I think, since the bell's not on the table, I can say it. I think, how the data were collected needs to be considered when we do consider the assignment of treatment.
Right. But I guess what I hear Rick saying is, depending on the data source, right, sometimes there's always worry about confounding, but sometimes you worry about other things even more, like the completeness of follow-up, for example, is EHR data. You leave the system, you go in another system, and your data flow stops, the data stream stops, right? Which is similar to what you pointed out, and you were looking at me, so I feel I need to respond to that now. The outcome proximal to treatment, right? That is not really related to the confounding, right? That's really more related to you have less opportunity for exposure misclassification, right? Or non-adherence, right? You get your drug, you get an anaphylactic reaction an hour later or 10 minutes later, right? There's very little that happens in between, right? So you get that squared away a little bit, right? The co-interventions happening, the shorter the effect follows the treatment, the less you worry about intermediate treatments, right? So that's why. It has nothing to do with confounding, really, in my mind at least, right?
We should just, don't have a lot of time to discuss this a little more. So the idea, for instance, that a complex and relatively downstream outcome, like all-cause mortality, versus a relatively proximal outcome, which at least I believe we might say we can more directly link to the effects of this treatment. Is there really a difference there? Would we say, we'd be more worried about an observational comparison when we have an outcome like all-cause mortality that could be influenced by all sorts of things?
Absolutely, absolutely. I mean, many pathways lead to death, obviously, right? So, and that
they all do in the long run.
To many opportunities for different sorts of confoundings. Well, if you have a very specific outcome that is highly related to the treatment that you're studying, right? Then you can, exclude many possible confoundings already, right?
Frank Sifakis with AstraZeneca. So I would suggest that maybe we also acknowledge that future state that includes continuous assessment and randomization real time, because I think it was framed as potentially where health systems might be looking at cost and doing A/B testing the same way that technology companies are developing products. But I think there could be an opportunity for a question such as, assessing the effectiveness of a drug in that context. That could make sense as well, right? And if it's where the future is going, I think we would be well served to incorporate that in our thinking potentially.
Yeah, and I think it's back to this, the question, and I think this was actually on our list and part of the discussion, that is random assignment of treatment, if we're aiming for valid inference, is it ever intrinsically bad? And I think we'd say no. It never leads us farther away from the right answer. The problem is it's often crazy expensive. It takes a hugely long time. It's a giant hassle, and patients and providers don't like it. But besides that, what's not to like? But all of what I think what your point is, how many of those things are fixable? In a healthcare system that worked like the healthcare system ought to, how many of those barriers to random assignment of treatment might go away?
So we heard this yesterday from Rob, of course, a lot about ongoing randomization. It makes perfect sense. You have multiple clinics in a setting, right? And then you randomize patients to the clinics, and you have different treatment strategies. What I'm worried about, a question for FDA really, again, you're interested in how the molecule works, not how the clinical strategy works, and can you disentangle those two? You have non-participation, even if you say, well, if you go into this room here, you follow that strategy, and you should always get treated with drug A, and here with drug B, and here with drug C. You will have non-participation and substantial non-participation potentially. How do you figure that out? So at best, what you have is instrumental variable. You have a little bit of a help with the baseline randomization, but you have to deal with the substantial non-participation, which you hope and pray is random, which you cannot prove, of course.
This is an area where we had this discussion earlier around kind of the nudge effects, and this would be a good time to make sure there's not more feedback on that. A lot of the quote-unquote randomization or types of randomization that happen in the real world, just like even in clinical trials, will not be to one specific treatment pattern or another definitively for a whole population, but will affect a limited part of that population. And I guess issues like in IMPACT AF is the question, what's the impact of a intervention to remind doctors and their patients that they ought to think about anticoagulation versus when that does show some effect on the use of anticoagulation, does that tell us more about the impact of different anticoagulation approaches? And I think those are going to be big, I think very, very important issues in moving into the real world setting, where the interest is probably less around intention to treat, but more around actual treatment of particular subgroups of patients.
And then, of course, these studies are extremely valuable. But for whom, right? And that was my question that I didn't really get a clear answer yesterday, is to what extent is the agency willing to go down this pathway to study clinical strategies versus just the molecule in the most narrow sense. And I see some, you move a little bit into that direction by the anticoagulants is a nice example. Warfarin treatment, right? You have variation in the TTR, right? In the different comparison groups, right? And how far do you want to push it? That was the whole discussion, right? And the more you let it play out, the more you go down this pathway of you studying a clinical strategy versus the pure molecule.
Well, I think people are always interested in not only whether the drug works, but whether it's too awful for anybody to use it and things like that. That's certainly interesting. As probably everybody knows, we just approved a claim for an old antipsychotic that the injectable form taken once a month keeps people out of prison and mental hospitals, and that's now in the labeling. It's not surprising. Its compliance is better than having to take it every day. So it's not astonishing, but that is an approved claim in Section 14.
So I was actually about to bring up that example, and maybe I could use that to illustrate Sebastian's point about this nudge trial a little more. So let's say that an imaginary hypothetical trial, we were interested in this exact question: would a long-acting injectable antipsychotic medication reduce risk of relapse, hospitalization, or other terrible outcomes in people with psychotic disorder? Okay, but what if we hadn't done that study, and instead of a more traditional, full random assignment, what if we said we're going to do a nudge study of that question? We're going to go into big healthcare systems and we're going to find people who just came out of the hospital, who are not taking a long-acting injectable, and we're going to randomly assign them. Half of them we'll just leave alone. They'll never know they were in a study. That they get their usual care. Half of them we send a letter to maybe them and their doctors, and we say, there's a different treat that might help you stay out of the hospital. And let's say in those group of people randomly assigned to receive that letter, we get the use of long-acting injectables up to, let me be really radically optimistic, 10%. I cannot imagine we would do better. But still, we've got a 10% versus, say, 0 or 1% difference that was produced by random assignment. And the sample is big enough that we observe a difference in rehospitalization rates or other bad outcomes. Can we run with that?
Don't know yet, but it's certainly an interesting question. Another question is whether, I don't know whether it goes in labeling, but it would certainly be of interest to know how to get people to use the injectable, like by reminding them. And we've included labeling statements about how to improve compliance. So I wouldn't rule any of that out. Whether the finding of less hospitalization would be credible, you'd always wonder that the people who decided to take the injectable aren't really the same as the others, because there's a choice to be made, and maybe they're just more likely to do this or that. So you'd always wonder about that.
This does get closer to, we were talking earlier about learning healthcare systems and other uses of these data besides for regulatory purposes. This gets much closer to the sort of things that healthcare organizations maybe aren't doing every day, but are trying to do more of, sorting out, are there ways to encourage more adherence to medications or more use of treatments that seem to be evidence-based that are being used now, not in the context of research studies, but in the context of health system operations, to try to improve quality. And the links of that to potential further insights about effects of treatments in subgroups of patients, or information that might be useful to have on the label to encourage more use of proven effective ways of applying the treatments, I think has not been very much explored yet.
Suppose you had a maneuver that you thought could get people to stay on their antihypertensives for more than the 6 months that's typical. I'm not sure something that showed how to do that couldn't become part of labeling. Failure to use antihypertensive medications is a leading cause of death and damage in this country, or lipid-lowering drugs and stuff like that. So I wouldn't rule those things out. I don't know if anybody else has comments, but I think those could be interesting. How to assure compliance is certainly not a trivial matter.
I'm just looking at some of the comments that come in. Rich Platt did send a comment about the TASTE trial, which you mentioned, and he said it's a nice example of true random assignment out in the real world being done on a large scale and pretty inexpensively. But, his point also was that this was because, the Swedish healthcare system has its act together, unlike ours, and that that they also invested significantly in registries in this area. So there is a significant upfront investment necessary to then achieve those economies.
It was also a one-shot intervention.
Yeah.
Did it on the first day.
Yeah, that may be something important and worth noting, that this randomization in the process of care may be simpler when there's one provider you have to influence and they have to do one thing and it happens today and then they're done.
I would just mention that I bet if you did a cost comparison between the record-keeping costs in Sweden compared to record-keeping costs in the U.S., it's still cheaper, despite that standard.
there's one other talking about, and this maybe is just a note to us to pay attention to, some work that Cochrane has done on blinding, need to look at that and say, how can that inform this? So we'll do. Could that really be all there is to say about do we need to randomize?
Well, it does seem like we have plenty of material here and some good work to build on. You highlighted some of Sebastian's prior work, for example, and these issues about the interaction between capacity to do these studies and existing infrastructure. Maybe instead of having designed registries, having some more of those registry type practices and electronic data systems, which does seem like a feasible direction these days. So we've got some good material for a path forward. I would like to make sure people don't have other things to add.
Well, I guess I'm looking at my notes from yesterday, and the one thing it may have been in here, but may not have been underlined enough is, when we're using naturalistic treatment assignment or observational comparisons, the transparency is really important. In terms of being able to show all of your design decisions, actually to have some sort of version control on those design decisions, and even version control on the code you use to implement those design decisions, and making that available for anyone to look at. Because this is maybe this is just returning to that Mulligan problem. We need to see every decision that you made.
Comment on the Mulligan problem, if we were at that stage. We had a little bit of a solution for that when we did our open science experiment with Harlan Krumholtz and Zeke Emanuel, who helped run the program. So we took one of our products and made all the 25 clinical studies available to the public. And what they did was they allowed anybody who wanted to get the data to specifically file a question that they wanted to answer. And then the data was given to them as a license to answer that question. It was then recorded on a Yale website as to the question that this group was answering in advance, and then they would monitor to see what they published. And if they published something different, they would call them out as academic misconduct. And that was in part of the contract. That if they found that they wanted to ask a second question, they could do that and refile. We would know that they probably did a little data dredging first to get that second question, but that would be a buyer beware issue to go forward. But we did control that pretty well, at least in that experiment on having access to the data, is that we required them to specifically state the question they want to ask first, and then do the analysis. And we know that everybody's going to do a little bit of data dredging, but at least it was sequential, and one could say that this is the third time I asked this question, and people would be a little bit more wary about that conclusion.
It's sort of the observational study, as I see it, sort of parallel to allocation concealment in a traditional randomized trial. What did you know and when did you know it? And did you know something early enough that you could have fudged things? I think we have the procedures for that better worked out for allocation concealment. You're typical reading your randomized trial, allocation procedure, and you're saying, well, there was a study statistician at a central site and people did this, and this is how we made sure that people on the ground had no advanced knowledge of allocation and could not have influenced eligibility decisions based on expected allocation. So that I think we've got that part pretty worked out. But it'd be interesting to think we haven't worked this part out quite as well in terms of the equivalent of allocation concealment, meaning how able were you to look at something before you said that was the question you were going to ask?
David? I'm not sure if we mentioned this on the Mulligan issue today, but the other idea was obviously the idea of going beyond just the transparency, but actually in the group that is having to review the information and make a decision going forward into replication, perhaps in a different data source. That is another way of pressure testing what was done by the original group submitting the information, and that's probably worth keeping as an option on the list. Since likely real effects are likely to be estimated in different databases and hold up, and sort of p-hacked effects may only hold up in the house of cards in which they were constructed in a specific database.
Yeah, may not be a good idea, but I do a lot of work now in the machine learning world, and what's interesting about the machine learning world is you don't have to argue about whether you got the right answer, because you're essentially required to hold out a random sample of your data, specify your model, and then test. Well, you could lie about the results, I guess, but that discipline is pretty clear, and it's even possible to enforce that discipline, to say, show me the audit trail of the random holdout sample. We don't tend to do that with observational research. Should that become a standard, that you've got a random, because the sample sizes available these days are often pretty huge, should you be required to identify a random holdout sample and have a clear audit trail of that and then show that your results replicate?
Well, that's required for clinical trials, to produce the data for the regulators to be able to look at. And so it's really worth thinking about the same bar for observational studies, but then you get into, well, what about the process, and what about the ability to do sensitivity analysis and make changes to the definition and how that will affect the outcome. So really kind of putting bars around what that data would look like and how extensively it would be able to be managed, I think is really the question. But I like that idea.
Looked like you were looking at me, so I don't know if I have permission to speak, but I think both of those approaches I think all three of these are different approaches that we should look at, over the period that we're operating under our framework and evaluating different ways of doing this, because you raise a good point that there could be like a replication activity, but simultaneously there could also just be an activity based on the transparency that was sufficient and that was provided, that then leads to requests from the reviewer to have additional analyses conducted in a transparent fashion. But in other words, they can be sensitivity analyses driven not just by the group providing the evidence, but by the consumer of the evidence, and that's another approach. So I feel like all three of these, either just going through and potentially going through replication as the consumer, is a bit like what you're talking about, and just removing sort of the intermediary. But there could be valid reasons for doing either one. I think that depends on probably practical issues largely. So all three of these seem like reasonable things to keep under this mulligan issue.
So are we getting to the summing up time, you think?
Another comment.
Okay.
Jennifer Graff, National Pharmaceutical Council. So one thing I heard, or building off of what I heard, was we need to be suspicious if there was a change. Let's say that there was the ICD-9, ICD-10 code issue that you described yesterday, and you got a result. I would want the analysts to say, hey, this happened. Here's how we changed the result, and here's why. So I think it's not just if they change the results, it's being transparent about why they did it. What are all of the different audit functions that come along? And then just to provide some background, we did some work with Academy Health last fall, and then did a roundtable on February 6th, where we looked at all of the different ways that different biopharmaceutical companies are conducting observational studies. And what we're seeing is really that there's an evolution, and perhaps a few can speak to it, or if Jesse was here, he would also be able to speak to it. But we're seeing a lot more sophistication in terms of outlining the plan, putting that in a lockbox internally or some public available source. The people that are actually doing the programming and coding are a separate team, and until that's locked down, it doesn't move forward. Each of those elements have a version control, and so they have each of those elements. And in my mind, that version control is probably as important as knowing, here's an answer. It was an answer I came up with and we thought, but there's all these reasons that we think it's wrong because ICD-9, ICD-10 change, reimbursement change, some other thing that goes on in the real world. That's more important to others. And so what I would add to this is not just the version control, but making the separation between the group that's conducting the analysis and those that are writing those, having a bit of a firewall is quite useful. And that it's more of saying what we did, what we set out to do, and what we changed, versus you didn't do what you said you were going to do, and therefore shame on you.
Just one quick comment, but it's prompted by this discussion about process, but I think it cuts across all three areas that we've discussed, and if that's okay. I think it would be helpful. There's a lot discussed, a lot of solutions, obviously, because of very good reasons. I think it would be good to always tie it back to overarching purpose, right, which is to leverage real-world data to bring products to market or medicines to market faster and at lower cost. And so it would be good to assess
without compromising public safety.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so it would be good to sort of go through what has been proposed and discussed, and make sure that whatever is put forth is not more cumbersome or more costly potentially than what exists today. And I think that remaining true to public trust and safety and transparency, but also leveraging the technologies that are becoming available to us is probably a good way forward.
Yeah, and I think, is it a Ben Franklin quote originally that I'll paraphrase, that I didn't have time to make a 10-point checklist, so I made a 100-point checklist? The 100-point checklist is not very useful because all will fail. What we want is a 10-point checklist that's actually useful. Yeah, Twain, okay, got it.